G'day! I forgot to start the recording. G'day! At least I realized it as soon as we started. As soon as we started the stream, instead of getting like an hour in and being like, oh shoot, I forgot. Anyway, welcome to the stream. It is me, Melody Sea Turtle. This is probably the dumbest idea I've ever had for a stream. So for those of you who don't know, you haven't read my bio, you haven't checked out my Twitter, whatever, you may not know that I'm not just a VTuber. I don't just stream video games, I also write. I am trying to be an author. So I've been working on a novel. I generally refer to it as TKN, but that stands for The Killing Nexus. And so I've been working on that for the good part of almost 2 years now. It'll be 2 years. Well, 2 years in March that I started working on it, but 2 years in April since the prologue was posted. Because it is available online if people want to read it. It's available for free, but it's also like a first draft sort of thing. So there are things that like I want to go back and fix up, and there's stuff that there's still typos that I apparently missed somehow. But so recently I had finished what I'm calling a chapter, but they're long enough that they can basically be books by themselves. So I recently finished chapter 3, and so I was proofreading it. I've been proofreading it to try and get out most of the typos and do any editing that I need in order to have it ready to post. However, streaming has kind of gotten in the way of that sometimes, because on Mondays and Fridays when I stream after work, sometimes they go a bit late there, and then I don't have time to do my proofreading afterwards. So while I don't think I could ever write on stream, simply because I need to concentrate while doing that, I felt like maybe I could proofread on stream so that I'm still, streaming, but at the same time, I'm getting stuff done for my novel. Now, admittedly, this is probably a very bad decision because it's right in the middle of the chapter. So even if you have checked out my stuff on like Wattpad or DeviantArt, you won't have context for what's going on. But I figured, hey, maybe this can serve as like, if folks are interested in seeing what the hell I've been doing, why I call myself an author, this can serve as a little bit of an insight, and maybe if you like what you see, you might be interested in checking out the actual thing. Anyway, let's go over to the scene where I've got it up. So I've actually got it cut off at the bottom. Never mind. We're on. I finished up to like here, but I'll read this paragraph again, just to like lead into it. So I don't know if I'm really going to be focusing too much on doing like voices and dramatic readings and stuff. This is basically just me being like, hey, I've got to do some work. If y'all want to have a look and see what I'm doing, you can. I think once it's in a better state, because there are stuff in like the early chapters that I want to fix up, once it's in a better state, then maybe I'll make like an audiobook version of it, or I'll just do like a stream where I read it to you guys, story time, that sort of thing. And just for context, The Killing Nexus is kind of a rip-off of Danganronpa. So if you don't like that sort of thing, it's probably not going to be for you, because it does get into some some not too great things. Anyway, we'll just start from here. So one by one, members of the group headed off to do whatever it was they had planned for the day. Kirito Estate. Why did I think this was a good idea? I need to read things out loud. Normally I read them in my head, but that's probably why I miss so many typos when I'm proofreading. One by one, members of the group headed off to do whatever it was they had planned for the day. Kirito stayed a little longer than he normally did. Oh, Kirito is the main character, by the way, in case anyone was curious. Kirito stayed back a little longer than he normally did, mainly because he wasn't really sure what he should be spending the day on. Though he was still far from the last to leave. Okay, maybe I shouldn't do an audiobook version because I'm fucking terrible at reading, not writing. My writing is at least decent, I'd like to think. Jeez, we're almost 10 minutes in and we haven't even read the first paragraph. Though he was still far from the last to leave, he knew he had to make his time productive somehow, but what exactly was there for him to do? Usually things just worked out in such a way that there was clearly something for him to do, but what was there right now? Okay, that feels a bit awkward. Something he should be doing. See, I get very distracted when I'm, like, writing, and so I often don't notice that I'm using the exact same turn of phrase, like 2 sentences in a row. But then when I read it back, it ends up feeling awkward. Something he should be doing, but what was there right now? Clove? After last night, Kirito didn't fancy going for round 2 so quickly, and he seemed to be slowly picking up regardless. Marcus? He also seemed to have recovered after last night, and was back to just generally being grouchy about everything. Roxy? Absolutely not. Not after her outburst this morning. As luck would have it though, the perfect opportunity jumped right into his lap as he stood up. Yeah, I'm not gonna do voices. My throat isn't exactly in the best state as it is. And I'd probably get a bit too nervous trying to do voices on the stream. Because, like, with Deltarune it didn't matter, I can just mess around, but, like, these are my characters. I feel like if I'm going to be voicing them, I should be voicing them properly. Hey Kirito, Sybil asked, turning around in her chair. Do you have anything you needed to do this morning? No, not really, Kirito replied. A little caught off guard to be called out by Sybil of all people. She was on reasonably good terms with him, but in general she didn't seem all too personal, especially considering what she'd done this morning. What could she need from him? Did she and Ace need help with the stocktake or something? It feels weird not doing voices, so screw it. I'll do it. Even if it makes me a little embarrassed. Oh shoot, what was Kirito's voice again? Normally I voice them like quietly to myself, but trying to actually speak it out loud is weird. Especially with my stomach growling at me, hopefully that's not turning up on the stream audio. I am unmuted, right? I haven't been talking to my... Yes, okay, good. Where were we? Why? Did you need something? Sybil remained silent for a moment, awkwardly glancing away. But after receiving a small nod from Ace, who was still sitting next to her, she gave her answer. There's someone I wanted to speak with, but I don't know if they'd be willing to listen to me. You seem to be pretty good with most people, so I was wondering if you could help. Even if it's just for moral support or something. As she spoke, Sybil's gaze slowly drifted towards the floor, seemingly out of embarrassment. Was she not used to asking for help from people like this? Joining a conversation solely for moral support, watching in while the other two conversed, seemed like it would be more than a little awkward, but he supposed it wouldn't be too much different from the night he'd helped Jennifer speak to Eve. Despite it now being one of his final memories of Eve, it had actually been a rather nice night, learning more about Eve's upbringing and her perspective on the world. Perhaps this would be something similar. Perhaps this would be something similar, though Kirito had no idea who Sybil would want to speak to. Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to help. When did you want to do this? Now, Sybil stated, as if it should have been obvious. Is that a problem? Kirito pursed his lips. He knew he should have been used to how blunt Sybil was by now, but that one still caught him off guard a little. No, that's no problem. No, that's no problem, but aren't you supposed to be doing the stock take right now? Sybil had already confessed to him that she didn't really see the point of the stock take, but he still thought it would be a little irresponsible to simply end it without telling anyone. Oh shoot, what does Ace sound like? Sybil has already discussed this with me, Ace stated, standing up from the table. I shall perform the stock take this morning, and Sybil shall verify the results in the afternoon. They're all going to sound the same. I'm too nervous. Alright, I guess that works. Kirito is supposed to have a very, light accent. He probably sounds a little American because that's the kind of English he learned, but he's actually supposed to be Japanese. But I don't feel confident giving him a Japanese accent without it coming across as, sounding racist, you know? Alright, I guess that works. Kirito said, in the back of his mind. In the back of his mind, he wondered whether that was actually a good plan or not. At a surface level, the same thing as usual was occurring. Two people would each check the contents of the armory in order to verify each other's results, and ensure one person didn't take anything. It could even be a little more favorable, as if anything went missing, they'd be able to tell during what time frame it was taken. However, to a greater extent, it somewhat defeated the point of having two people do it in the first place. Verifying each other's accounts was one thing, but if they didn't do their count at the same time, both of them keeping tabs on each other, one of them could easily just lie about their totals in order to steal one of the weapons themselves. That, of course, would require Sybil or Ace doing something so dishonest as taking one of the weapons, though. Presumably with intent to commit murder. I think get rid of that, though. That, of course, would require Sybil or Ace doing something so dishonest as taking one of the weapons, presumably with intent to commit murder, and despite Sybil's threats and Ace's emotionless facade, Kirito wanted to believe that they could be trusted. So for now, Kirito decided to just go along with their plan, though he made a mental note to raise his concerns if this became a recurring event. So, are you ready to go? Sybil asked, standing up as well. Sure. Where are we going? Who did you need to speak with? Sybil glanced around the room. The few people still remaining. Glanced around the room. I can see what I'm trying to say there, but I don't know the right way to put it. Sybil glanced around at the room. I guess at the few people. Glanced around the room at the few people still remaining at the table. And at Marcus hovering around the kitchen, before looking back at Kirito. Just come with me. Kirito couldn't fathom why Sybil would want to keep whatever they were doing a secret so badly, but he supposed he'd find out when they got got to where they were going. Perhaps he was supposed to take her unwillingness to divulge information as a bad sign, but he trusted her not to do anything too bad. Well, at least nothing worse than what she'd already threatened to do this morning. Alright, lead the way, he replied with a shrug. Sybil nodded and... buddy work email going off on my phone. Sybil nodded and turned towards the door, out of the dining room. Before awkwardly looking... Sybil nodded and turned towards the door. And turned towards the door out of the dining room, before awkwardly looking back at Kirito for a moment. Thanks, by the way, she said, before quickly turning back again and heading towards the door. You're welcome, Kirito said as he hurried to catch up, not sure what to make of Sybil's behavior. Was she really not used to asking for help and thanking people like this? She'd never come across as particularly socially awkward. She was incredibly blunt, sure, but this seemed more like something on Eve's level. What caught his attention more than Sybil's words, though, was what he heard as he left. It sounded like laughter. It was rather quiet, as if the source was trying to hide it, but it definitely seemed like someone was chuckling a little behind his back. Was that Ace? Perhaps he was starting to show his emotions after all. I did not remember writing that in. See, the thing is... I can't show you because I've cropped it out. This entire chapter is 405 pages, and then about roughly 245,000 words. So I wrote this over the course of a year, and a lot of the earlier stuff I remember what happens generally, but I don't remember all the little details. So I don't remember that I actually made Ace laugh like that. Anyway, let's continue. This would probably be easier if I had plugged my mouse in, but I figured I didn't really need it for this stream. Alright. Letting his mind dwell on that thought, Kirito silently followed as Sybil led him through the living room and out into the yard. Eliminating Roxy and Noel as potential people Sybil wanted to talk to. He didn't exactly expect that to be the case, but... he didn't exactly expect that to be the case. He doubted anyone would be dumb enough to attempt that right now. I keep having these weird run-on sentences. Let's just get rid of it after what happened this morning. But considering Sybil was the only one who seemed to be willing to actively stand up against Roxy, she was probably the person most likely to try. Regardless, Sybil continued to lead the way across the yard, stopping in front of a door Kirito hadn't been expecting them to go through. The library? He wondered aloud, noticing which door Sybil had led them to. Yulia had still been in the dining room, being slow as usual to finish her meal, and Naomi was hanging out with Miles in the game room this morning. Which meant there was only one person she could possibly wish to speak with in here. Before he could even ask, Sybil was already confirming his suspicions. I want to talk to Jennifer about something, she said, still facing the door. I see. Kirito mumbled, his voice trailing off. His mind was already racing with possibilities. Sybil hadn't seemed to be on particularly good terms with Jennifer. When they last spoke. When last they spoke, sorry. Oh, did I seriously miss a full stop? Wow. Had she had a change of heart? Was she trying to mend any bridges she may have inadvertently burned over the past week or so? Or perhaps she just had something important to bring up. While Jennifer insisted she wasn't the leader of the group, she was most certainly the member of the group most responsible for keeping the peace at the moment. Regardless, there was only one way to find out. Well, shall we go in? Right, Sybil said. It was... What the hell? Oh, it was only now that Kirito noticed she seemed to be hesitating a little. Her hand was grasping the doorknob, but she had yet to actually open the door. Perhaps the reason she'd bothered to stop and explain herself was because she wished for him to inquire further, to stall her by questioning her actions. Was she nervous? Regardless, at Kirito's urging, Sybil pushed open the door to the library, and the pair stepped inside. Even in the doorway, Sybil hesitated for a moment, though if she was nervous before, this time she was hesitating for a different reason. The archive is in the back, right? It was only now that Kirito realized Sybil had never actually visited the library. I really used "it was only now." I used that twice. This is why I kind of sometimes hesitate in calling myself an author. Because I look at stuff like this and I'm like, geez, what was I doing? It was then that Kirito realized that Sybil had never actually visited the library. Yeah, come on, I'll show you. Sybil nodded and hummed to show her appreciation, as Kirito led the way through the many bookcases of the library. It was still a little amazing how large the library was compared to every other room they'd received thus far, especially since it seemed to be the most harmless. Perhaps it was important for another reason, but considering Yulia and Naomi had yet to find anything in their examination of the books, he doubted it. Regardless, the pair soon reached the back wall of the library, and the small door that sat at its center. There it is. No, that's not his voice. Is it? There it is, Kirito said, pointing towards the door. Sybil said nothing as she approached the door, Kirito following closely behind. With a deep breath, she raised her hand and knocked. Now Kirito was sure she was nervous. Why would she knock otherwise? It wasn't like she was checking to see if the bathroom was occupied or something. Come in! I can't do a voice for Jennifer. The voice I imagine her with is too close to my own voice. Come in, came the reply from the other side of the door, sounding a little confused as to why Sybil had bothered knocking. With a small, though still evident amount of hesitation, Sybil pushed open the door and the pair headed inside. There they found Jennifer, sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes of documents, a file open on her lap. From what Kirito could remember from the last time he'd been in here, most of the files had been shuffled around a bit, and all seemed to have something written on the front. Perhaps a way of identifying what was inside each folder. Or just which one she'd already checked. She certainly seemed to be making good progress, though considering how she was sitting, Kirito couldn't help but wonder if she was actually taking it seriously. Oh, Kirito, Sybil, hey. Oh, Kirito, Sybil, hey. What brings you here? What brings you two here? I don't know what intonation I'm supposed to read that in. Are you seriously sitting on the floor? Sybil asked, furrowing her brow as she stared at Jennifer. Any nerve she'd had about this conversation seemed to have fled upon seeing Jennifer in such an odd position. There weren't any chairs in here, Jennifer replied with a shrug. Glancing around, Kirito found her assertion to be accurate. It seemed this room was supposed to be used for storage, and you were supposed to take the documents out to the main library if you wanted to read them. Besides, all the best study sessions happen on the floor. She's not supposed to be American. She's supposed to be Aussie. Besides, all the best study sessions happen on the floor. All it's missing is a half-eaten pizza and a stereo playing wildly inappropriate music. That doesn't sound like the best way to focus, Kirito said with an awkward grin. While he knew everyone studied in their own way, Jennifer's idea of a study session sounded uncomfortable and distracting. Probably not, but it got me through high school well enough. Anyway, did you two need me for something? Is Roxy being a nuisance again? Noticing the way Sybil awkwardly glanced away, Kirito decided to take the initiative. Sybil did bring him here in order to facilitate the conversation, after all. Yeah, actually. Sybil wanted to talk to you about something. Oh? Now that's a surprise, Jennifer mumbled, apparently just as in the dark about what this conversation would entail as Kirito was. The pair looked at Sybil expectantly, waiting for her to bring up the topic she'd come to discuss. While her nerves had been subtle before, now they were evident for all to see. Whatever she was about to ask must really be eating at her. With a deep breath, Sybil finally spoke, beginning what was sure to be an eye-opening, if a bit awkward, conversation. What is Alec to you? She asked. This again? Jennifer asked, pulling a less than impressed expression. I think putting on sounds better though. Putting on a less than impressed expression. Kirito had almost forgotten on account of discovering Eve's body only minutes later, but Sybil had actually brought this up a few days ago. For some reason, she'd been interested in Jennifer's relationship with Alec. Alec, good. He'd been interested enough in Jennifer's relationship with Alec that she'd even tried to ask him to try and get the information secondhand. Is secondhand one word or two? If I do that... Okay, it's one word. What was it about Jennifer and Alec that had her so pressed? I didn't get an answer last time. Yeah, that's because it's none of your business. Now if you'll excuse me, I still have to get through the rest of these documents, and I'd like to finish up today. Jennifer lowered her gaze once more, focusing on the file that was placed on her lap. Kirito thought now was probably when he was supposed to intervene, to say something to get Jennifer to listen, but given he had no idea why Sybil wanted to know this sort of thing, he wasn't entirely sure what he should be saying. Thankfully, it seems Sybil didn't need his help, as after another deep breath, she spoke up for herself. You wanted to know what happened at the Olympics, right? Huh? Kirito mumbled, even more caught off guard by this assertion than her first one. It's not an assertion, that's a question, you dumbass. Having been reminded of his last proper conversation with Sybil, he now distinctly recalled that she didn't really want to talk about the Olympics, and especially didn't want Jennifer to interview her about them. Was this really so important that she'd be willing to divulge that information just to get what she wanted out of Jennifer? Excuse me? Jennifer asked as she looked up again. Just as caught off guard as Kirito was. That's what you wanted to know, right? Well, now we both have something we want to know from each other, Sybil stated, her voice taking on a somewhat cold and emotionless feel. Perhaps she felt more in control now that she'd managed to catch Jennifer off guard. Or perhaps she was just doing it to mask how nervous she was. What do you say to an exchange of information? That's what journalists do, right? Look, I don't know what sort of idea you have of my profession. I don't know what sort of idea... Yeah, of my profession... No. I don't know what sort of idea you have in your head of about my profession. But, Jennifer said, her voice trailing off as she moved the file she was reading, and stood up. Perhaps she realized the floor wasn't the best place to be sitting for what was shaping up to be a rather important conversation. Can I ask why you brought Kirito? Are you fine with talking about this in front of him? I'm a moral support, Kirito explained, giving an awkward wave. Sort of like I was for you when you wanted to speak to Eve. Jennifer nodded, apparently understanding what he meant, although the expression on her face told Kirito that perhaps she didn't think moral support was the best way to describe it. I'm fine with it if you are, Sybil stated bluntly, catching Kirito by surprise. Was she really so comfortable around him that she'd be willing to let him in on her secret? The thing that she hadn't been comfortable discussing mere days ago? Perhaps investigating together had brought them closer than he thought. Oh please, I doubt I'll be saying anything Kirito hasn't already heard. Sybil gave Kirito a questioning glance upon hearing that. It was only now that Kirito was realizing just how much he knew about everyone in the group. Though there were probably individuals that knew more about, he seemed to have the most knowledge on the collective. It was as if he had some sort of aura that made people willing to talk to him, to divulge details about their life. It's called being a protagonist. If that didn't make him an even bigger target, he didn't know what... If that didn't make him an even bigger target, he didn't know what did. What would. Regardless of his trepidation, Jennifer continued. Anyway, this exchange was your idea. I think it's only fair you go first. Sybil nodded. I assume I can trust you to hold up your end of the deal. Of course, I'm a woman of my word. Besides, you're the one with the bowl, and Kirito's blocking the door. I couldn't skip out even if I wanted to. Kirito pursed his lips together, suddenly feeling very uncomfortable with being roped into this conversation. The way she'd phrased it almost made it seem as if he was deliberately keeping her here until she confessed her deepest secrets or something. We can even shake on it if you want. That's not necessary. Sybil quickly said the moment Jennifer extended her hand, prompting her to quickly retract it. Prompting her to swiftly retract it. Using quickly twice in the same sentence feels weird. I guess I should start with what the rest of the world saw. You probably already know about it, but Kirito doesn't. Sure, go ahead, Jennifer stated. Kirito also silently gave a nod. Alright, as you already know, I qualified to compete in the Olympics for archery a few years ago. Even though I should have been too young to even compete in the qualifying rounds. My caregivers lied about my age so I'd be allowed to compete. And after seeing how good I was, the people managing the American teams had to argue with the Olympic Committee for permission to keep me on the team. They figured they couldn't let the opportunity to let me compete at such a young age pass them by. Not when it meant showing up the other countries or securing some stupid record or something. Sybil paused for a moment, glancing over at Kirito to ensure he was getting all of this. Kirito simply nodded. Aside from that last detail, this had all been things he'd heard when he first met Sybil. This wasn't anything new. It wasn't anything new. What she said next, however, was, on the day I was set to compete, broadcast live around the world, I missed every single shot. You... huh? Kirito mumbled, completely dumbfounded. Did he hear that right? How could the same girl who'd been able to hit bullseyes while only giving herself a second to aim after not practicing for a week? How could... Let me break it up a bit differently. How could the girl who was able... Nah. How could the same girl who was able to hit bullseyes while only giving herself a bare second to aim after not practicing for a week miss all of her shots at such an important event? Like, it makes sense, but I feel like I've phrased it weirdly, but I can't think of a better way to phrase it. Granted, she did say it had happened a few years ago, but considering she qualified in the first place, he couldn't imagine there being that much of a skill gap between then and now. Now it made sense why she'd seemed hesitant to talk about it, and why Jennifer was so interested in learning more. You heard me right, Sybil stated, just in case Kirito had any doubts. I didn't hit the target once. I was thrown off the team and more or less blacklisted from ever representing America in international competitions. I didn't exactly pay much attention to the media, but from what I heard it was all over the news. Yeah, that's about right, Jennifer chimed in, naturally being more familiar with the news than Sybil was. Newspapers, TV stations, you name it. Everyone was covering the story of the so-called prodigy child athlete who choked under the pressure. She paused for a moment, perhaps waiting to see if Sybil would continue. When Sybil remained silent, perhaps to see if Jennifer had more to say. Had any more to say? Yeah, that's a bit of an awkward, repeating, but I think I'm gonna keep it in just because, I don't know, the repetition seems interesting to me. There. She paused for a moment, perhaps waiting to see if Sybil would continue, while Sybil remained silent. Perhaps waiting to see if Jennifer had more to say, and Kirito stood around awkwardly, feeling like he was the only one who had no idea what was going on. That wasn't the whole story, though, was it? Sybil continued her silence for just a moment, staring directly at Jennifer before she spoke up again. Your intuition is going to get you in trouble one day. Jennifer simply shrugged, a somewhat smug grin on her face. Oh please, it wasn't too difficult to figure out. You refused any interviews, your caregivers did all the talking for you, the organizers took pretty harsh measures for... Oh, the organizers... Yeah. Took pretty harsh measures, so, punishments. That they're dishing out rather than receiving, so yeah. The organizers took pretty harsh measurements from what everyone was reporting as a mistake, and your name basically just stopped showing up in competitions. That all adds up to something fishy going on. Honestly, I'm surprised there weren't more journalists calling foul play instead of just running with the story they'd been told. Sybil hummed, looking off at a random corner of the room. Keep talking like that, I might start thinking I misjudged you. Misjudged her? Kirito asked, not sure what to make of Sybil's statement. Though there was always the possibility she'd explain without his intervention, Sybil's opinion of Jennifer was not the topic of conversation right now, so he wanted to make sure it didn't get skipped over. Too much talking. I didn't have any meetings today. How is my mouth so, like, dryish? And just mucked up completely. She's a journalist, Sybil said bluntly. They're all nosy bastards who constantly hunger for a good story. Yeah, I think I got hungry and hunger mixed up. Who constantly hunger for a good story. They'll eat up anything if you give. They'll eat up anything you give them and just run with it. And my caregivers knew that. Or at least I thought they were all like that. Maybe I was wrong. Well, don't get me wrong, I am constantly hungry for a good story. Kirito can attest to that. Yeah. I've had to stop her from badgering people a few times already. Kirito said, awkwardly scratching the back of his head. While her views on journalists did seem a little overly negative, it seemed they weren't entirely unfounded if Jennifer was anything to go by. What I'm not interested in is clicks, sales, views, etc. Other news outlets are constantly having to slam out clickbait articles to try and drive traffic to their sites. I just like investigating interesting news stories and sharing the facts with my readers. I see. Sybil mumbled, apparently not sure what to make of Jennifer's outlook on her career. So what's the truth of what happened at the Olympics? What did your caregivers keep under wraps? So now you can see why this is a proofreading stream and not just a story time. You can see how many heckin' typos I miss when I'm writing. Sybil remained silent for a moment, looking off in a random direction again, seemingly needing to compose herself before she answered. While waiting for a response, Kirito couldn't help but notice her hands seemed to have drifted down to her quiver, running her fingers along the fletching of her arrows. Perhaps she and Jennifer weren't so different after all. I missed my shots on purpose, Sybil finally said, her gaze finally resting back on Jennifer again. You threw it? Kirito asked, trying not to sound too incredulous. Somehow the idea of someone deliberately messing up on one of the biggest stages an athlete could hope to perform on seemed even more unrealistic than Sybil missing every shot unintentionally. Called it, Jennifer said someone smugly, fetching her notepad from the floor to make some notes. You already knew? Sybil asked, raising an eyebrow at Jennifer. I had my suspicions. Even ignoring all the other factors, there's no way you can just chalk it up to nerves when someone who performs as well as you did in the qualifiers suddenly misses every shot they take. It was either sabotage or an intentional throw, and I feel like all the American news outlets would be running with every scrap of evidence they could get if there was any hint of there being some sort of sabotage conspiracy. Well, you're right. I threw it. There's your truth. Not yet. Excuse me? Sybil narrowed her eyes at Jennifer, seemingly a little annoyed by Jennifer's response. Kirito was also a little caught off guard. What exactly did she mean? Did she doubt Sybil's answer? Anyone with enough wits can figure out the what. Like you said, I already did. Now that I've confirmed that, though, what I want to know is the why. Why would a young athlete with a promising career in archery throw it all away when the world's eyes were on her. While Kirito felt Jennifer's questions might be getting a little too invasive, he had to admit he was thinking the same thing. No matter how much he racked his brain, he couldn't seem to find a reasonable explanation for her behavior. Sybil let out a small sigh, her head dropping a little. I guess there was no avoiding it. She'd have expected this when you came to speak to a journalist. Jennifer replied with a playful wink, apparently having no concerns with playing into Sybil's generalized view of what journalists were like. Ha! Maybe I didn't misjudge you after all, Sybil grumbled. Though how seriously she was being with that statement, Kirito was unable to tell. Fine. The truth is, I don't really have... I'm reading that wrong. Fine. The truth is, I don't really have any interest in competing. Archery is something important to me, but not as a sport. It's just something I like to put my time into. My caregivers were the one who had the idea of me competing. Right, you mentioned that your caregivers pressured you to compete so they could brag about you, or something like that, didn't you? Kirito said, recalling the time she and Marcus had discussed what their respective parents thought of their hobbies. Jennifer glanced over at Kirito as he said that, perhaps wondering when he'd come by that piece of knowledge, but quickly diverted her attention back towards Sybil. Yeah, that's about right. At first they thought my interest in archery was a bit weird. Apparently it was too dangerous for someone my age to have as a hobby. Then they realized how good I was at it, and they started looking for competitions for me to compete in. I went along with it at first. I figured it'd get them off my back, if I just gave them what they wanted. But I guess people like that will never be satisfied. You were forced to compete in more competitions with higher stakes and more visibility, right? Jennifer asked, earning a glare and a raised eyebrow from Sybil. Kirito couldn't help but wonder if she'd already known that, or if she was just extrapolating from Sybil's statement. But she was quick to explain herself. Sorry, I did a bit of digging after I heard you were refusing interviews. Wanted to see if I could figure out what was going on instead of just believing the story your caregivers were giving the media. Sybil exhaled loudly and deeply, before rolling her eyes and continuing her explanation of what had happened at the Olympics. Yes, I kept being entered in more and more competitions. I kept it up because I figured they'd stop eventually, and it was good practice anyway. But it just kept coming and the more time they spent flaunting my talents, the less time I got by myself to practice seriously. If I refused, they'd just sign me up without telling me and take me whether I wanted to go or not. Once we were at the venue, it wouldn't just be pressure from them, it'd also be all the other competitors and spectators, and well, that's kind of a lot of pressure for a kid to refuse. Kirito silently nodded, though he could scarcely imagine the Sybil he knew today letting herself be pushed around like that. He had to remind himself that this all happened a few years ago, likely before Sybil was even a teenager. To put that kind of pressure on a child solely to brag about their achievements, he could understand why Sybil referred to the adults she lived with as her caregivers instead of her parents, regardless of what their actual relation to her was. The more he learned about everyone's familial status, the more grateful he felt that his mother was always looking out for him. It all sort of built up until they finally tried to push it too far. It went from competing in front of people from my city, to people from my state, to people across the country, all the way up to the Olympics. Competing in front of the whole world. By that point, I'd had enough. I think, comma there. By that point, I'd had enough. I thought there was no way it'd ever go through. Even if they signed me up without my approval, there's no way I'd be accepted once they found out how young I was. So I just treated the qualifiers the same as always. But, well, you know how that turned out. Your caregivers lied about your age, and the judges didn't care once they saw your skill. Yep. At that point, there was no real pulling out. But I knew if I just treated the Olympics the same way I treated all the other competitions they entered me in, I'd never hear the end of it. My caregivers would just keep parading around the fact that I was in the Olympics, and that'd probably mean even more competitions so they could show me off and brag to all the other parents. So I did the only thing I could think of. You threw the competition? Kirito asked, wanting to make sure he was following Sybil's explanation correctly. That certainly wouldn't have been the only thing he would have thought of in that situation. But then again, he'd never met Sybil's caregivers, so his only point of reference for them was what Sybil had told him. I think that should be a double M. I figured if I screwed up on the biggest stage imaginable, they'd never want to hear about archery ever again. Anytime they tried to brag about me, people would just remind them of how much of a failure I was at the Olympics. At least, that was what I hoped. They managed to play it off as nerves to the media, but they still eased off a bit with the archery competitions. I suppose that makes sense, Jennifer said, scribbling something down on her notepad. I take your caregivers were behind you not being able to speak to the media? Sybil nodded. They sort of realized why I screwed up so bad, and they were worried I'd blab to the media about how they forced me into competitions. So they were aware they were doing something bad after all, huh? Jennifer mumbled, still looking at her notepad instead of at Sybil. And yet they kept going. Some people just really aren't fit to be parents. Hey, why didn't you speak to the media about that? If you were really supposed to be like one of the youngest athletes ever, surely you must have had interviews before you actually competed, right? Couldn't you have just... Oh, Kirito asked. Did I read out the Kirito asked bit? Oh well. Before you actually competed, right? Couldn't you have exposed everything before you had to go and miss all those shots? Before you had to go out and miss all those shots. Okay. Yeah, it makes grammatical sense. I didn't want to expose everything, though. Sybil mumbled, her gaze drifting off to a corner of the room again. For whatever reason, my sister really cares about our caregivers. She's happy with them. Where was I? If I went and exposed how awful they were about forcing me to compete, we'd be taken away from them and we'd end up with someone else. Screwing up in front of the entire world was the only solution I came up with that would keep my sister happy while also getting our caregivers to stop using me for their own satisfaction. Kirito silently nodded in response. He couldn't exactly argue with that. While he didn't have any siblings himself, considering Sybil's sister was the most important person in her life, according to her last motive. According to the last motive is probably better. According to the last motive, he could imagine she'd be willing to do whatever she could to make her happy, even at the cost of not being entirely happy herself. Jennifer nodded as well, though far less silently. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm satisfied with that answer. Where is it? Said, placing her notepad back in her pocket. Thank you for sharing, Sybil. So what's going to happen now? Sybil asked, apparently wanting to discuss this a little more before she moved on to her own inquiries. Am I going to end up in one of your articles after we get out of here? Depends, Jennifer said bluntly, surprising Kirito a little. Was she really just going to throw away a story again, like she did with Eve? Was this another case of it being Sybil's story to tell? Jennifer's morals as a journalist were really something else, to be turning down so many groundbreaking stories. On? Sybil asked, not having the same recognition of Jennifer's intentions as Kirito did. On whether you want me to. On whether you want me to. Don't get me wrong, this would make for a fantastic article, but I can't in good conscience share this with the world knowing that you basically only confessed in order to get something from me, and especially not after hearing why you kept it from the media all this time. If you want it out there, I'll be happy to spread the word, but until then, I'll just let the people believe it was nerves. Yeah, I definitely misjudged you, Sybil said with a small smirk, though it quickly faded away. Which unfortunately makes the next part a bit harder. The next part? Oh, the next part? Kirito asked. He knew what Sybil was referring to, but he couldn't fathom why Sybil's opinion of Jennifer changing would make that any harder. Right. You wanted to know what I thought of Alec, right? Her gentle expression turning more serious. Jennifer said, her gentle expression turning a little more serious. Yes. Right, well, I actually knew a bit about Alec before we got here. Supposedly he was a former police detective who left the force to set up his own private detective agency, valuing finding the truth above all else. I thought that was pretty admirable, and kind of in line with my own philosophy towards journalism. So I wanted to interview him for an article. Then I met him here at the facility, and he was a little more eccentric than I thought he'd be, but his dedication to the truth and keeping everyone alive was still something I really admired. Jennifer furrowed her brow, seemingly trying to find the right words to phrase her answer. Perhaps she thought the answer she'd previously given Kirito was a touch too embarrassing to say in front of Sybil. He was someone I really looked up to, I guess. Someone who fueled my drive to keep going. And I know... Oh. And I know he fell to C's motive and tried to kill someone, but he kind of still is all that to me. Yeah, 2 instead of 4. I probably wouldn't be where I am right now if I hadn't gotten the chance to meet him, even if I only knew him for a few days. Sybil stood silently, staring at Jennifer, and taking in everything she'd said. She didn't seem him to give any sort of reaction to anything she was being told, almost as if she'd already known it all, right up until the end, where she scoffed a little. Yeah, that's obvious, she said, rolling her eyes a little. Is it really? You basically admitted it during breakfast. Whenever you step up to do something literally outside of an investigation, you're basically just borrowing from him. Yeah, I guess so. Like I said, I know he was the first to fall to C's motives, but before that, he was super determined to make sure everyone survived and we could all escape together. We've lost a few members of the group already, but for those of us left, I still want to see his goals come true. Don't, Sybil said bluntly, taking both Kirito and Jennifer off guard. What did she mean by that? Did she want more people to die or something? Huh? Kirito mumbled, reflexively taking a step back away from Sybil. She probably didn't mean anything bad, and it was just her usual bluntness. Where did it go? It's just her usual bluntness making her words seem worse than they were. But that didn't stop it from coming across rather poorly. Excuse me? Jennifer said, crossing her arms and raising an eyebrow. Her reaction wasn't as strong as Kirito's was. but it was clear she wasn't too happy with Sybil's statement. Don't live your life for him. If you want to keep everyone alive and have us escape as one big happy family, fine. Good even. But do it for yourself, not for him. Sybil, what is this about? I know you already answered my questions about you and everything, but if you're going to come here asking how I feel about Alec and then start lecturing me about it, I'd like to know why. Sybil glanced away for a moment, before turning her gaze back towards Jennifer, a determined look in her eyes. Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you. Remember, already almost at 10 pages, that's what I usually try to get done in a night. Man, removing distractions really does wonders. Does wonders for my ability to focus. Ignoring Kirito's mumbling, Sybil began to explain. I had a feeling you thought of him that way, but I wanted to confirm it. Maybe he was just a happy memory or something, and not someone you looked up to or idolized. But no. I didn't exactly want to ruin your memory of him, but he's not someone you should be idolizing. Why? Because he tried to commit murder and pin it on you? I'm already aware of that. I'm not going to say he's perfect, but none of us are. C found his price and dangled it in front of his face until he acted upon it. Same with Blaine, same with Brooke. And honestly, if C found my price, whatever it would be, I can't promise you that I wouldn't be having thoughts about murder the same way they were. It was somewhat chilling to hear Jennifer speaking like that, almost justifying murder. Kirito had already heard about her concept of everyone having a price, something they'd be willing to kill for, but for her to outright say that she'd consider killing someone if C found a motive strong enough was worrying, to say the least. Sybil was undaunted though. She simply stood and listened to Jennifer's explanation, before taking a deep breath and offering her counter, her face adorned with a stony expression. Do you remember what I said this morning? About why I threatened Roxy the way I did? Jennifer simply raised an eyebrow, wondering why Sybil was being as cryptic as she was. Kirito, on the other hand, had a few ideas about what was going on. Either she was trying to use Jennifer's own argument strategy that she had employed during the debates, leading the debate using questions so that those listening could be set on her own path of logic, or she was hiding something she didn't want to say. The possibilities of the latter option worried Kirito, but he'd never find out which it was if the conversation drew to a halt. And so he chose to play Sybil's game and answer her question. The end justifies the means, right? He said, reversing the step away he'd taken earlier. Roxy didn't want to listen to reason, so you threatened her in order to get her to stop. Sybil gave a small nod in Kirito's direction before turning back to Jennifer. That's the kind of person Alec was. I may be like that myself a bit. Adding that just because it makes Sybil feel a bit less, I don't know, hypocritical. But it's not the kind of person you should idolize or aspire to be like. Jennifer stood silently for a moment. Staring at Sybil. Sybil simply met her gaze. How did I... Her eyes just as fierce as Jennifer's. Once again, Kirito felt like he was being privy to a conversation he should not have been hearing. He wasn't sure what he should do about the tension in the air, if he could even do anything. But he hoped that, at least by being here, he could prevent this from turning violent. After what felt like ages, but was probably no longer than a minute, Jennifer finally spoke. Look, Sybil, I know you're more blunt than most people, but there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, you know. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, you know. Alec may have tried to frame you, but you don't have to go slandering the dead. It's only slander if it isn't true, Sybil stated. Kirito was surprised to hear such words being added without a single ounce of smugness. Despite her blunt nature, Sybil must really be taking whatever was making her act like this seriously. Jennifer, on the other hand, only seemed to see the words and not the tone. Perhaps a little too blinded by how close she was with Alec. "Oh, you think this is funny or something?" she said, her hands tightening into fists. If there was ever a time for Kirito to intervene, despite feeling like he shouldn't have been here for this conversation in the first place, now was probably it. Jennifer, he said, calmly raising a hand towards her as he caught her attention. Maybe we should let Sybil explain why she thinks of Alec like this instead of just assuming she's insulting him for no reason. Jennifer stared back at Kirito, her gaze just a little softer than the one she'd used for Sybil. He could practically hear the gears ticking in her head as she stood firm, glancing back at Sybil a few times. Eventually, she relented, letting out a small sigh. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, I kinda lost my cool for a bit. I think I'm gonna end it off there. I know I still have time. Dinner's not ready yet. It's probably gonna be ready soon, though. And I don't want to completely blow out my voice, because I do have work tomorrow, and also I have a doctor's appointment in the morning. It should be fine. Hopefully that's given you like a good taste of what TKN's like. I do have a link in the description to my Wattpad, I believe. Hold on, let me check to make sure. Is it in there? Yes, I do have a link to my Wattpad in there. If you want to read the rest of TKN, I'm hoping to have the what am I trying to say? I'm hoping to have Chapter 3 fully proofread and ready to be posted sometime next month. I was aiming for end of this month, but considering we only just reached the halfway point yesterday, probably not going to happen. It will still be before the 2-year anniversary of TKN, though. 2-year anniversary of the prologue being posted. Hopefully. Anyway, thank you for watching, if you sat through all of this. It's probably not the most interesting stream, but, you know, it helped me focus a bit, so I'm happy with it. And I got to have my two hobbies crossing over for once. Anyway, thanks for watching. Otsukame, bye bye.